7 days later, he was shocked by what he saw. He was just a boy from the street. She was the millionaire everyone envied. A week after the wedding, he accidentally opened one of the doors in her house and realized why she had chosen him. Subscribe and subscribe in the comments where you're watching from. The air was thick with the dull stench of damp cardboard and motor oil. The city's pulse beating faintly through the cracked pavement. Rain had fallen earlier that morning, leaving the streets slick and glistening under the pale winter sun. In the shadow of an abandoned warehouse, nestled between stacks of discarded crates and rusting metal barrels, a small boy sat huddled beside a sleeping child. His name was Jaden, and at just 12 years old, he carried more weight on his thin shoulders than most men twice his age. Jaden's arms were wrapped protectively around his sister, Amara, a 5-year-old with wide eyes and a voice like a whisper. Her face was smudged with soot and sleep. Her tiny fingers curled around the hem of her brother's coat as if it were the only thing anchoring her to safety. Jaden's coat had once been green, now faded to a muddy gray, torn at the seams and 2 sizes too big. He wore it like armor. They had been living like this for 8 months, ever since their mother's heart had given out in the emergency room of a free clinic on the south side of the city. There had been no funeral, no flowers, no family. Just a death certificate crumpled at the bottom of Jaden's backpack and a promise whispered in a hospital hallway, "I'll take care of you, Amara. I won't let anyone take you from me." That promise had kept them alive. Every morning, Jaden rose before the sun and ventured out in search of food or work or both. Sometimes, if he was lucky, he could help unload supply trucks behind the corner market or clean up after the construction crews working a few blocks away. They never paid much, usually $5 or $10, a sandwich if he was lucky, but it was enough to keep Amara fed and to buy a little time before someone noticed them. Being noticed was dangerous. The Department of Child Services had visited the hospital once, back when their mother first fell ill. A man in a sweater vest with a clipboard had asked Jaden if there were any relatives. Jaden had lied. He had said yes. He had said they would be picking them up soon. He had watched that man's eyes for doubt, for suspicion, and when it hadn't come, he had walked out of the hospital with Amara's hand in his, never looking back. That lie had saved them, but every day since then had been a game of hiding in plain sight. Today, like most days, Jaden had risen early and crept across the city toward the newest construction site. The workers there were used to seeing him, small, silent, and quick. He knew how to make himself useful without being told, how to carry stacks of broken wood to the dumpsters or sweep up nails and debris without slowing anyone down. The foreman didn't ask questions, and Jaden never spoke unless spoken to. By noon, his stomach was growling, but he forced himself to ignore it. Amara would be waking soon, and she would need something to eat. He managed to scavenge a banana and half a protein bar from a dumpster behind a convenience store. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As he crossed the street on his way back to the warehouse, he saw her. A white woman, tall and elegant, even in a raincoat, stood alone on the sidewalk just beyond the construction zone. She was holding a leather handbag close to her chest, her silver hair gathered into a twist at the base of her neck. She looked out of place, like someone who belonged in a penthouse or a private car, not on the edge of an industrial site. Jaden slowed, watching her from the corner of his eye. Something about her posture put him on alert. She was stiff, almost frozen, her back to the street. Then he saw it. A man, creeping up behind her, his hood pulled low and his movements sharp. The attack was sudden. The man lunged, yanking at her purse. The woman resisted, and he shoved her hard against a wall. Her cry echoed off the buildings, and Jaden didn't think. He ran. He launched himself at the man, fists swinging wildly. The man cursed and turned, catching Jaden with an elbow across the face, but Jaden didn't stop. He clawed at the man's arms, kicked at his legs, biting and screaming until the purse dropped and the attacker shoved him to the ground and fled. Jaden's vision blurred as he sat up, blood trickling from his mouth. The woman stared at him, wide-eyed and silent. Then she knelt beside him. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice controlled but urgent. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood, grabbed the purse from the ground, and thrust it into her arms. Then, before she could call the police or ask any more questions, he turned and ran. By the time he reached the warehouse, his lip was swollen and his hands were scraped raw. Amara was awake, her eyes lighting up when she saw him. "Jaden," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. He held her close, hiding his face in her shoulder so she wouldn't see the blood. That night, as the city settled into silence and the wind crept through the cracks in the walls, Jaden lay beside Amara and stared at the ceiling. He didn't know who the woman was or why she'd looked at him the way she had. All he knew was that his world was small and shrinking, and every day felt more like a countdown. What he didn't know was that the woman hadn't forgotten him. Her name was Elizabeth Harding, and she had spent the last 4 decades building one of the most powerful construction empires in the state. She lived in a mansion with more bedrooms than she could count, and fewer people than she could stand. She had once been married, briefly, tragically, and had no children. Her days were filled with contracts and meetings and a quiet ache she pretended not to feel. But something about the boy had stayed with her. His eyes. The way he didn't hesitate. The way he bled for a stranger without asking for anything in return. The next morning, she sent her assistant to the construction site with strict instructions. Find that boy. It didn't take long. Jaden wasn't hard to spot. Small, dark-skinned, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big. He was lifting bricks into a wheelbarrow when the assistant approached him. "Miss Harding wants to see you," the man said. Jaden's first instinct was to run, but something, maybe hunger, maybe exhaustion, maybe curiosity, stopped him. He looked at the man's suit, the clean shoes, the black car parked at the curb. Then he looked at the sky, gray and low, as if the world itself was pressing down on him. "What does she want?" he asked. She didn't say. Jaden hesitated. Then, without another word, he followed the man into the car. He didn't know it yet, but the moment he sat down, his life began to change. Not in the way he had dreamed. There were no fairy tales in Jaden's world, but in a way that would stretch the limits of who he was and who he might become. As the car pulled away from the curb, he looked out the window at the warehouse disappearing behind him and felt a twinge of fear. Not of what he was leaving, but of what might be waiting ahead. The car ride felt longer than it was. Jaden sat stiffly in the back seat, his hands clasped in his lap, his eyes darting to the tinted window every few seconds. The leather beneath him was smooth and unfamiliar, the kind of texture that belonged to a world he had only glimpsed from the outside. Every turn of the vehicle made his stomach tighten. Every second that passed made him more certain that he had made a mistake. He didn't know where they were going, didn't know who this woman really was. All he had was a name, Elizabeth Harding, and a sense that somehow the ground beneath him was shifting. The car eventually slowed and turned through tall wrought iron gates. They creaked open with mechanical precision, revealing a long driveway lined with hedges trimmed into perfect shapes. At the end of the path stood a house, or perhaps a mansion, its size almost comical in contrast to the warehouse Jaden had slept in the night before. White stone, wide steps, black shuttered windows, and a roof that stretched like a crown over the entire structure. Jaden stared at it in disbelief. It didn't seem real. It looked like something from a movie or a magazine. Not a place for someone like him. The car came to a stop in front of the entrance. The assistant opened the door for him, but Jaden hesitated before stepping out. He felt the weight of his tattered clothes, the grime on his shoes, the dirt under his nails. He felt like a stain in a spotless room. Still, he climbed out, his chin lifted just slightly, forcing himself to meet the moment with whatever dignity he could muster. The assistant led him through double doors into a marble foyer. The floor gleamed under his feet, reflecting the massive chandelier that hung overhead. Paintings in gold frames lined the walls, and there was a smell in the air, lavender and something older, like polished wood and history. Jaden barely had time to take it in before a voice echoed from the staircase above. "Thank you, Mr. Tiller. I'll speak with him alone." Jaden looked up. Elizabeth Harding stood at the top of the stairs, dressed in a charcoal gray pantsuit that looked like it had been tailored for royalty. Her silver hair was swept back into a low twist, and her pale face was unreadable. She descended slowly, with the kind of grace that came from practice, and when she reached the bottom, she extended a hand to him. "You're hurt," she said, gesturing toward the fading bruise on his jaw. Jaden didn't take her hand. He didn't know what to say. He only nodded. She didn't seem offended. Instead, she turned and walked down a hallway lined with bookshelves and velvet drapes. "Come," she said, not looking back. He followed her to a room filled with glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out onto a manicured garden. A wide desk stood in the center, flanked by armchairs and flanked again by silence. She motioned for him to sit, and he did, perched on the edge of a leather seat like he might be asked to leave at any moment. She sat across from him, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I want to thank you," she said, "for what you did. Most people wouldn't have intervened." Jaden said nothing. His gaze flicked from her face to the window and back again. He felt like he was being examined under a microscope. "I've had you checked," she continued, her voice calm and clipped. "Not in a cruel way, but I needed to know who you were. I know your name. I know about your mother. I know that you and your sister have been living without guardianship since her passing." Jaden's throat went dry. His hands clenched. "I mean, you no harm," Elizabeth added. "Quite the opposite." "Then why am I here?" he asked. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but calculation. "Because I think you're the solution to a problem I have." Jaden shifted in his seat. Every instinct he had screamed for caution. Elizabeth leaned back, her gaze never leaving him. "I am dying, Jaden. Not dramatically or imminently, but the doctors tell me I have a year, maybe 2. Cancer. The kind that creeps through your bones slowly until there's nothing left to do." Jaden blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. "I have no children, no family worth naming. My company, my estate, everything I've built, it's all in danger of falling into the wrong hands after I'm gone." She stood and walked to the window, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "I built this company from nothing. My husband helped once. He's long gone now, but the vultures have circled ever since. Nephews, cousins, business rivals. They smile at my table and sharpen their knives when I leave the room. I refuse to die knowing they'll feast on what I built." Jaden didn't speak. He wasn't sure he could. "I need a solution," she said, "and I believe you might be it." She turned to face him again, her expression unflinching. "I want you to marry me." The silence that followed was so total it seemed to press against Jaden's ears. He stared at her, certain he had misheard. "You're joking," he finally said. "I'm not," she replied. "It wouldn't be a real marriage, not in the traditional sense. It would be a contract, a legal arrangement. You would be my husband in name only, and in return you would be my heir. I would see to your well-being, yours and your sister's, education, housing, security. You would never have to worry again." Jaden stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "That's crazy." "Is it?" she said. "You risked your life for a stranger. You live in squalor, afraid for your sister's safety every day, and I offer you a way out, a way forward." "You don't know me," Jaden said, his voice shaken. "You don't know anything about me." Elizabeth stepped forward. "I know enough. I know you have strength. I know you have loyalty. I know you're desperate enough to consider something unthinkable if it means saving someone you love." He turned to leave. "Think about it," she said softly. Jaden didn't respond. He walked down the hall, past the chandelier, out the doors, and back into the cold afternoon light. The driver took him back without a word. The warehouse loomed ahead like a memory that refused to fade. That night, he sat across from Amara in their makeshift corner, the flicker of a borrowed flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. He told her about the woman, about what she said, about what she offered. Amara listened, swinging her legs. She didn't understand everything, but she understood one thing very clearly. "I want to stay with you," she whispered, "always." Jaden didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he returned to the mansion. Elizabeth was waiting. "You've decided?" she asked. Jaden took a breath. "I'll do it." She nodded once. "The arrangements will begin immediately." And so it began. A plan that would redefine the course of both their lives. A decision made in desperation and shaped by need. Neither of them fully understood what they had agreed to, not yet. But the wheel had been set in motion, and there would be no turning back. The courthouse was a squat, unremarkable building, nestled between two larger and newer structures that gleamed with glass and ambition. It stood like an afterthought, its faded brick facade and iron steps weathered by time. Inside, the air was stale and filled with a distant echo of voices arguing about things that no longer seemed to matter once the gavel struck. It was here, in a room with no windows and too many shadows, that Jaden signed his name next to Elizabeth Harding's. The ceremony lasted all of 10 minutes. A clerk officiated, reading the standard vows in a voice so dry it could have come from a machine. Elizabeth stood tall and still beside Jaden, dressed in a sleek navy suit with a cream blouse, her face composed and distant. Jaden wore a borrowed suit that hung awkwardly from his slender frame, the collar a little too tight and the shoes half a size too big. He didn't look at her during the ceremony. He didn't look at anyone. When the clerk pronounced them husband and wife, no one clapped. There were no rings exchanged, no kisses, no celebration. Only a signature, an official seal, and a copy of the certificate handed to Elizabeth's lawyer, who folded it neatly into a leather portfolio without a word. As they exited the courthouse, Elizabeth paused beneath the overhang, shielding her eyes from the morning glare. Jaden stood beside her, shoulders tense, jaw clenched. She turned to him, her tone brisk but not unkind. "We'll go straight to the house. There's much to arrange." Jaden nodded once. The black car that had brought him days ago was waiting at the curb, but this time when the door opened, it felt different. He wasn't a guest anymore. He was a resident, a husband, a child married to a dying woman with a legacy to protect. The thought made his stomach twist. They drove in silence. At the estate, staff stood lined up in the foyer as they entered. Jaden noticed them trying not to stare. Their faces were carefully neutral, but their eyes flickered with something: curiosity, confusion, disbelief. He caught a few murmurs as he passed, whispers not meant to be heard. "He's just a boy. This is absurd. Does she think this will really work?" Elizabeth gave no sign of hearing them. She addressed the butler, Mr. Harris, with cool efficiency, issuing instructions regarding rooms, meals, and appointments. Jaden was led to a bedroom on the second floor, a vast space with a king-sized bed, antique armoire, a writing desk, and windows that looked out over the garden. Everything was too large, too elegant, too still. He set his small backpack on the floor, the only possession he carried, and sat at the edge of the bed. The mattress barely dipped beneath his weight. The silence pressed against his ears. Later that evening, a maid knocked and informed him that dinner would be served in the dining room. Jaden followed her down a grand staircase and through halls so long and ornate they felt like part of a museum. When they entered the dining room, he stopped. The table was long enough to seat 20, set with crystal glasses and silver cutlery that gleamed beneath a chandelier shaped like falling stars. Elizabeth sat at the head, dressed in a silk blouse and a strand of pearls. The rest of the table was empty. She gestured for him to sit at the other end. Dinner was served by staff who moved like shadows. Each plate was a work of art: roasted duck with cranberry glaze, sweet potato puree, wilted greens drizzled in olive oil. Jaden stared at the food, hesitant to touch it. He had eaten out of dumpsters. He had stolen fruit from roadside stands. This looked like it belonged on a magazine cover. "Eat," Elizabeth said. "It won't bite." He obeyed, mechanically lifting the fork, chewing slowly, the taste so rich it overwhelmed him. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. Halfway through the meal, Elizabeth spoke. "I've arranged for your sister's release." Jaden looked up, heart hammering. "I've used legal channels to request temporary guardianship. Given our new relationship and my status, the agency complied. She'll be brought here tomorrow." Relief flooded him so quickly it left him dizzy. He opened his mouth to thank her, but found that the words caught in his throat. "I've also taken the liberty of enrolling her in a nearby private school," she continued. "She'll have a tutor to ease the transition." Jaden didn't respond. He couldn't. His entire body was tight with a mix of gratitude, disbelief, and something else, something like guilt. It had happened so fast, too fast. After dinner, he returned to his room and stood at the window, staring out at the darkened garden. He saw himself reflected in the glass, a small figure in a too large room, caught in a situation he couldn't explain or understand. He touched the glass as if to confirm it was real. The next morning, he was waiting at the gate when the child services van arrived. The driver stepped out first, then opened the back door, and Amara appeared. She wore a little pink jacket and clutched a small battered backpack to her chest. Her eyes searched the grounds until they landed on Jaden, and then she broke into a run. "Jaden!" she cried, throwing herself into his arms. He lifted her, holding her so tightly he feared he might crush her. "I told you," he whispered. "I told you I'd bring you back." She looked around, her face lighting up in awe at the mansion. "Is this where we live now?" He nodded. Yeah. Elizabeth watched the reunion from the balcony, her face unreadable. She turned and walked back inside. That afternoon, Amara was shown to her own room, a smaller but equally elegant space, decorated in soft colors with shelves already stocked with books and toys. She squealed with delight and spun in circles on the plush rug. Jaden watched her, a strange ache blooming in his chest. She was happy. She was safe. That was all that mattered. But as the days passed, he began to feel the cracks in his new life. He was no longer free to disappear when he wanted. Tutors arrived every morning, teaching him math, business, law, public speaking. Elizabeth had a plan for him, and it was thorough. He was to be groomed not only as her heir, but as her voice, her representative, her legacy. It was overwhelming, and sometimes humiliating. He didn't understand half of what they said, and the other half made his head hurt. At night, he lay in bed and listened to the sounds of the mansion. The ticking of antique clocks, the creak of wooden beams, the distant footsteps of staff, and sometimes voices. Boy doesn't belong here. Does she expect us to accept this? Just a child. It's insane. He knew the staff talked when they thought he couldn't hear. He knew some of the extended family had caught wind of the marriage. One day he overheard a phone call, Elizabeth speaking with ice in her voice. "They're welcome to contest it," she said, "but they'll lose." Jaden didn't know what frightened him more, the fact that they might try or the certainty in her voice that they would fail. As weeks turned to months, Jaden settled into a rhythm. He studied. He watched over Amara. He ate dinners across a long table from a woman who never smiled but never raised her voice. She was strict but not cruel, distant but not unkind. She rarely spoke of herself. When she did, it was in fragments, hints of a husband long dead, a company built brick by brick, a life spent fighting for power in a world that had never wanted to give it to her. One evening, as he helped Amara into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Is Miss Elizabeth your mom now?" Jaden hesitated. "No," he said. "She's something else." He didn't know what word to use. She was a benefactor, a stranger, a partner in a transaction that had no name. She had saved them. She had trapped them. She had given them a future and taken away their past. That night, Jaden walked the halls of the mansion, his bare feet soundless on the marble. He paused outside Elizabeth's study, the door slightly ajar. Inside, she sat at her desk, her back to him, writing in a journal. The fire crackled beside her. The light flickered across the silver in her hair. He watched her for a moment, and for the first time he felt the weight of what he had become. Not just a boy. Not just a brother. A husband. A symbol. A piece on a board he barely understood. He turned away and walked back to his room, the silence behind him deep and endless. The early spring sun filtered through gauzy curtains, laying strips of pale light across the polished wooden floor of Jaden's room. He sat at the desk near the window, his head bent over a textbook, pencil clutched in one hand, the other resting on the edge of the page like an anchor. The room around him was silent, save for the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant hum of a gardener's shears outside. There was a tray beside him with untouched breakfast, slices of fruit arranged like art, eggs prepared with meticulous care, a small carafe of orange juice sweating condensation onto a linen napkin. It had been delivered, like clockwork as it was every morning, by someone who said nothing and left without a sound. Jaden was learning. Math, language, law, public relations, each subject woven into a rigid schedule administered by rotating tutors and instructors hired by Elizabeth Harding. They were polite, distant professionals, always careful, always watching. He performed well enough. He took notes. He asked questions when he didn't understand. But none of it felt real. It was performance, a role to be played in a theater built from wealth and legacy, with stakes he still didn't fully comprehend. Amara, in contrast, thrived. She loved her new school, her new clothes, her new room filled with books and dolls and glittering things. Every day she returned from school with stories about her teachers, her classmates, her drawings hung on classroom walls. She missed their old life only in flickers, mostly at night, when she would crawl into Jaden's bed and whisper memories that made his chest ache. But for the most part, she had adapted. She was a child, and children could learn to find joy even inside cages if the walls were painted bright enough. Jaden, though, felt the bars. Elizabeth remained constant. She did not soften, nor did she become colder. She was a fixture of control, never cruel, but always composed, a woman whose silence said as much as her speech. She asked him about his lessons. She monitored his progress. She watched over Amara's schooling with a meticulous eye. But she never asked how he felt, never volunteered pieces of her own life. At dinner, she made conversation in careful increments. News articles, business developments, legal topics she insisted he learn. She told him the names of board members he would someday have to meet. She outlined the company's structure. She explained how wealth worked in corridors he had never imagined. Jaden listened. He learned. But a part of him remained untouched, sealed away like the room at the end of the west hallway, the one that was always locked, the one no one ever entered. Then came the journalists. It started with an article, a glossy magazine cover showing Elizabeth Harding, poised and elegant, with a headline that asked, "The Boy Husband, Genius or Gambit?" Jaden saw it by accident. One of the staff had left the issue in the kitchen. The photo of him was grainy, clearly taken from a distance, and the accompanying piece speculated on motives, legality, ethics. It was written with feigned neutrality but thinly veiled judgment. A 12-year-old boy married to a woman nearly 60 years his senior, now living in luxury, now declared her heir. The article posed questions without answers, let implications speak louder than fact. The next few weeks brought more. Paparazzi gathered at the gates. Photos were taken from hidden cars. Talk shows debated whether Elizabeth had lost her mind or committed a masterstroke of manipulation. They questioned Jaden's intelligence, his background, his silence. They questioned Amara's presence in the home. They questioned whether any of it was real. Jaden had tried to ignore them, but the noise bled through the walls. He overheard the staff discussing it in hushed tones. He saw the way some of them looked at him differently now, less like a child and more like a puzzle they didn't want to solve. One afternoon, Elizabeth summoned him to her office. She was seated behind her massive desk, her posture ramrod straight, a tablet in her hand. Without looking up, she said, "You'll need to prepare a public statement." Jaden stared at her. "About what?" She tapped the screen and turned it toward him, a photo of Amara on the playground. The headline below read, "Child Bride's Little Sister, Another Pawn in Elizabeth Harding's Strange Empire." His stomach dropped. "You'll say nothing untrue," Elizabeth said, "but you will speak. It's time the public heard from you." He wanted to protest. He wanted to scream that none of this was fair, that he didn't ask for this, that he was just a boy trying to keep his sister safe. But instead, he nodded. He'd learned by now that resistance was a slow death in this house. Silence was survival. They held the press conference in the drawing room, staged like a political address. Jaden stood behind a podium, wearing a dark blazer that Elizabeth's tailor had adjusted to fit him. Cameras flashed. Reporters called his name. He had rehearsed every word of the statement Elizabeth had helped him write. But when he looked up and saw the sea of skeptical faces, something shifted inside him. He spoke clearly, calmly, but he altered the script. Just slightly. Enough to tell the truth without revealing everything. Enough to show a mind behind the mask. He spoke about responsibility, about loyalty, about the things you do when no one else will do them. He didn't say he loved Elizabeth. He didn't say he didn't. He said he respected her. He said she had offered him and his sister a life they could never have dreamed of, and that he intended to honor that by learning everything he could and working harder than anyone expected. The press devoured it. The story morphed again. Now he was a prodigy, a strategic genius in the body of a child. Now people argued over whether he had manipulated Elizabeth instead of the other way around. He hated all of it. One night, not long after, Jaden walked the halls after everyone had gone to bed. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made your thoughts louder. He wandered without direction until he found himself at the west hallway, the one with the locked door. To his surprise, the door was open. Inside was a room unlike any other in the house. It was lived in. A small sitting area, bookshelves overflowing, a grand piano pushed to one side. On the walls were paintings, some of Elizabeth, some of a man Jaden had never seen. There were photos, too, one of a young couple in wedding attire, one of Elizabeth standing beside a man in a hard hat at a construction site, smiling in a way Jaden had never seen her smile. He stepped inside slowly, as if the air itself might shatter. On the desk was a journal, closed, with a ribbon tucked inside. He didn't open it. Not yet. Behind him, the floor creaked. "You're not supposed to be in here." He turned. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I didn't know it was open," he said. "I left it open," she replied. A long pause stretched between them. "Why?" "Because you needed to see something that wasn't controlled, something human." Jaden swallowed hard. "Who was he?" "My husband," she said, "the only person who ever saw all of me." She didn't say anything else. She turned and left. Jaden remained in the room for a while, looking at the photos, at the sheet music on the piano, at the worn armchair beside the window. He thought about the woman who ruled the house like a queen, and realized she had once been someone else. Someone softer. Someone who had built walls to protect herself from the world, and from pain. Later, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he wondered what it meant to live in a house so full of silence and secrets. He wondered what part of himself he was losing in exchange for security. He thought of Amara, asleep in a room that looked like a dream, and wondered what kind of man he would become in order to protect that dream. He had food, clothes, education. He had safety. But freedom? Freedom had a different face. Jaden wasn't sure he'd seen it in weeks. The next morning, he returned to his studies. He greeted the tutor. He reviewed contracts and balance sheets and speeches. He performed. He adapted. But deep inside, a part of him remained still, watching, waiting. And, in the back of his mind, the golden bars of his new life glinted in the light of understanding. Spring drifted slowly into summer, painting the trees in deeper greens and filling the garden with the scent of blooming roses. The days at the Harding estate fell into a steady rhythm, precise, quiet, and almost unnervingly predictable. Jaden had grown used to the structure of his new life. He woke early, studied until the afternoon, ate dinners in silence across the long dining table from Elizabeth, and watched over Amara with the kind of devotion only an older brother forged in hardship could possess. Yet, with every passing day, a feeling grew within him, something cold and knotted, something restless. He was no longer surviving, but he wasn't living either. He was performing. It wasn't one moment that broke the illusion, but a slow accumulation of subtle shifts. Whispers from the staff that ceased abruptly when he entered a room. Conversations on the phone that Elizabeth ended too quickly. Guests that visited for private meetings behind closed doors. Questions that hung in the air but were never answered. The world he had entered was full of silken shadows, and behind them he began to sense truths that had nothing to do with him, yet somehow had everything to do with why he had been brought here. The west wing of the house became an obsession. It was the oldest part of the estate, and the most heavily guarded, not with alarms or guards, but with silence. While most rooms were open and polished, the west corridor was dim, the curtains drawn, the air colder. There were no maids dusting here, no flowers placed in vases, no signs of life. Only a hallway of closed doors. Most were locked. One had been left open once, Elizabeth's hidden sanctuary, the room with photographs and a piano, but even that door had been closed and locked again since that night. One afternoon, during his free hour between studies, Jaden lingered in the hallway. He stood before one of the doors, the one at the very end, with a brass handle that gleamed dully in the dim light. He had passed it dozens of times. He had touched the knob once, only to find it immovable. But that day, he noticed something different. A faint scuff on the floor beneath the door, as if it had been opened recently. His heart thudded. He turned away, forcing himself to walk back to the main part of the house, but his mind stayed behind. That night, after Amara had fallen asleep and the mansion settled into its midnight hush, Jaden slipped from his room, barefoot and silent. The hallway stretched before him like a secret untold. He moved carefully, the polished wood cool under his feet, his shadow long in the moonlight spilling through the windows. When he reached the door, he paused. He stared at it for a long time before reaching into the pocket of his pajama pants and pulling out the small key he had taken from Elizabeth's study 2 nights prior when she'd stepped out to take a phone call. He had seen it glittering beside her journal, ornate and out of place, and something in his gut had told him it mattered. He inserted the key into the lock. It clicked. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a room swallowed in dust and stillness. Moonlight streamed through the narrow windows, illuminating motes that danced in the air like fading memories. Jaden stepped inside, heart pounding. This room was unlike any he'd seen in the house. It was preserved, untouched by time. The wallpaper had faded but remained elegant, and the furniture, though draped in white cloths, bore the shape of a life once lived. A writing desk stood in the corner, old but dignified. Beside it, a file cabinet, rusted slightly at the hinges. On a small table rested a collection of silver-framed photographs, their images yellowed. Jaden approached them slowly. The first frame held a picture of a younger Elizabeth, barely in her 30s, standing beside a man with a hard jaw and a half-smile. His arm was around her. There was something unguarded in her eyes that Jaden had never seen in real life. Another photo showed the same man at a construction site, wearing a helmet, talking with two other men. Jaden leaned closer. One of the men looked familiar. Not personally, but there was something about the lines of his face. He reached for the photo and turned it over. Written in the slanted script on the back were 3 names. The last made his breath catch. Charles King, Jaden's father's name. His hand trembled as he replaced the photo and turned toward the desk. Papers were scattered across its surface. Contracts, financial reports, letters, all bearing the letterhead of Harding Construction. He sifted through them, careful not to disturb the order more than necessary. Some were dated over 20 years ago. He scanned the names, the numbers, the signatures. Then he found it. A letter written in ink that had faded slightly but remained legible. It was addressed to Elizabeth's husband. The handwriting was tight, angry. It accused Charles King of breach of contract, of deception, of fraud. The language was direct, almost brutal. "You stole from us," it read. "You bled this company dry. You left us with nothing but dust and lawsuits. You killed everything we built." Jaden stumbled back from the desk, the letter still in his hand. Killed. The word echoed in his skull. His father. The man he remembered only in flashes, rough hands, a tired voice, the smell of cigarettes and concrete. Could he have done this? Could he have ruined another family, left them in ruin? And if so, what did that make Jaden now? His eyes fell on a second document, a marriage license. His name. Elizabeth Harding's. But the date was wrong. It was weeks before the ceremony, before the conversation, before the press. The ink was bold, notarized, stamped, finalized. Jaden's knees weakened. He sat heavily in the old chair by the window. Everything felt distant, unreal. He reached for the journal on the side table, the one with the red ribbon he had noticed the night he first saw this room. He hesitated only a moment before opening it. The first entries were dry, clinical, notes on company shares, on meetings, on strategies. Then they changed. "They think I'm weak," one entry read. "They think grief is the end of me, but I will turn grief into legacy. I will take what was stolen and reclaim it." Another, "I found the boy." The irony is almost poetic. Charles King's son, living in the gutters, reduced to nothing, just like he left us. Just like he left Harold. If I take him in, if I make him mine, legally, then everything will be balanced. The public will worship the story, the board will bow to succession, and Charles's bloodline will serve mine. Jaden closed the journal with a snap. He felt sick. Every act of kindness, every meal, every lesson, every carefully worded speech. They weren't bridges, they were chains, and he had walked into them willingly, blind to the truth. He wasn't a son. He wasn't a partner. He was a pawn in a revenge so old it had become ritual. A creak behind him made him freeze. He turned slowly. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. "I wondered when you would find this place," she said quietly. Jaden stood, fists clenched. "Why?" he demanded. "Why me?" She stepped into the room, her bare feet silent on the rug. She looked at the photos, the letters, the open journal. "Because you were there. Because you existed, and because no one would question it. A lost boy, a noble story." The symmetry was too perfect. Jaden shook his head. "This isn't justice, it's manipulation." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "Your father destroyed my life, my husband, our company. I spent 2 decades rebuilding what he stole, and when I saw you, starving, dirty, fierce, I saw a way to finish what he started. I thought if I controlled the next generation of kings, I could silence the past. Jaden's voice cracked. I didn't do anything. I know, she said softer. And that's the part I didn't expect. You weren't like him. You were better. He turned away from her. He felt cold, as if the truth had scraped his insides clean. I'll leave, he said. Tonight. Elizabeth didn't move. You can. I won't stop you. But Amara stays. Jaden spun around. You can't. She is under my guardianship, legally. If you run, I will invoke abandonment, and she will go back into the system. He stared at her, stunned. You would do that? I wouldn't want to, she said, but I will protect what I've built, at any cost. Jaden's vision blurred with rage and confusion. This isn't over, he said. Elizabeth nodded slowly. No, it isn't. And she turned and walked away, leaving the door open behind her. Jaden stood alone in the room that smelled of dust and betrayal, surrounded by ghosts that were never his to carry, but had become his all the same. The sun had begun to rise, casting the first pale light over the garden. It touched the photographs, the letters, the truth. And Jaden realized he had been brought here as a symbol, but he would decide what that symbol meant. Not her. Not anymore. The morning after discovering the truth, Jaden moved through the Harding estate like a shadow of himself. The house, which had once seemed vast and mysterious, now felt suffocating and calculated. Every corner a reminder that nothing in his life here had come without strings. The polished floors gleamed with too much intent. The grand staircase, which once struck him as a symbol of power, now felt like a stage. Even the garden, where he had sometimes sat with Amara and watched the butterflies, seemed rehearsed, sterile, unreal. Elizabeth had not spoken to him since their confrontation in the West Wing. She had returned to her routines with perfect poise, as though the revelation had changed nothing, and in some ways, perhaps it hadn't. She had played her game exactly as she intended, and Jaden had stepped into her web willingly, however unknowingly. But what she hadn't counted on, what she had failed to anticipate, was the will she had awakened in him. Not obedience, not submission. Something else. Something sharper. He waited, biding his time. He said nothing to Amara, though he watched her more closely now, listened more carefully to her stories from school, asked her questions that had nothing to do with her lessons. He told her he loved her more often, and meant it with a new intensity. He began collecting pieces of information during the days, tracing names, looking into legal processes, remembering every document he had read. He dug into the estate's archives. He stayed up late reading law books, case precedents, guardianship statutes. Elizabeth continued to act as though everything was in its place. She instructed his tutors. She oversaw his curriculum. She attended board meetings and made calculated remarks about the company's future with young Mr. King Harding at the helm. She even smiled occasionally in his direction, cool, unreadable smiles that no longer confused him. She had gotten what she wanted, a legacy, an heir, and a story the public had come to adore. But there was one thing she had not secured: his compliance. When the letter arrived from her nephew's attorney, challenging the legality of the marriage and the inheritance arrangements, Elizabeth summoned Jaden to her office. The room was as immaculate as ever, the windows open to let in the late summer breeze. The letter sat on the desk between them, heavy with implications. "They're moving forward with their claim," she said. "I know," Jaden replied. She studied him. "You're remarkably calm." "I expected it," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "And I've prepared." She narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" "I've retained someone," he said. "A lawyer. A real one, not yours." Her face remained perfectly still. Only a slight tension in her jaw betrayed her surprise. "You've been planning this," she said. He didn't deny it. "I needed to know what rights I actually have, what rights Amara has, what's real in all of this, and what's performance." Elizabeth leaned back in her chair. "And what have you discovered?" "That I may be a minor, but I'm not powerless, and that the courts don't take kindly to manipulation, especially where children are involved." A flicker of something passed through her expression. Was it admiration or annoyance? Jaden couldn't tell. "The hearing will proceed," she said. "There's no avoiding it. They want to prove this marriage is a fraud." "And are they wrong?" he asked. She looked at him for a long time. Then she turned her gaze to the window. "That depends on how you define fraud." The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing. Reporters lined the sidewalk outside, their cameras flashing as Jaden stepped from the black car, dressed in a tailored navy suit and holding Amara's hand tightly in his own. The crowd murmured as they passed, some pointing, others whispering. He ignored them all. Inside, the room was thick with tension. Elizabeth sat with her lawyer at one table, composed as always. Across the aisle sat her nephew, a smug-looking man in a gray suit, flanked by two aggressive attorneys and a media advisor. They looked at Jaden like he was a chess piece gone rogue. The judge was a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a tired voice. She called the court to order and laid out the scope of the hearing, to determine whether the marriage between Elizabeth Harding and Jaden King had been entered into under duress or fraud, and whether it violated any statutory codes that would nullify its legal effects, particularly regarding inheritance and guardianship. Jaden's lawyer, a kind-eyed black woman named Camille Grant, rose to speak first. She laid out the facts plainly. Elizabeth had entered a legal, state-sanctioned marriage with Jaden, with full awareness of his age and circumstances. Guardianship of Amara had been transferred through formal processes, not backdoor arrangements. The marriage, while unconventional, was not illegal. And unless evidence could be presented that Jaden had been coerced or manipulated, there was no basis to nullify the union. The opposing counsel argued otherwise. They presented photographs, headlines, expert testimony from psychologists who had never met Jaden but speculated on the trauma such a situation might cause. They painted a portrait of Elizabeth as a cunning manipulator and Jaden as a helpless child, coerced into servitude under the guise of inheritance. Jaden listened to all of it in silence. Then, when his name was called to testify, he stood and walked to the witness stand. He looked out at the courtroom, not just the attorneys and the judge, but the spectators, the journalists, the members of the public who had come to witness the unfolding spectacle. He took a deep breath and began. He spoke of his mother, of the nights he had held his sister's hand while they slept in warehouses and under bridges, of the promise he had made at her bedside, of the hunger, the fear, the constant motion of a life on the run from systems that failed more children than they saved. He spoke of Elizabeth's offer, of how he hadn't understood it fully at first, but knew that it came with something he couldn't refuse: safety. Not for him, for Amara. He didn't pretend to love Elizabeth. He didn't lie about their relationship. He told the truth, that it was strange, that it was complicated, that it was built on things most people couldn't understand. But then he said this: "I was desperate, but I wasn't stupid. I made a choice, I weighed the cost, and I accepted the deal. Not for money, not for status, but because it gave my sister a chance at something she never had, a future." He looked toward Elizabeth as he said it, and for the first time he saw something real pass through her eyes. Not victory, not satisfaction, something like regret. The courtroom was quiet when he finished. The judge called for recess. Outside, the media erupted, but Jaden ignored them. He sat on a bench in the hallway, Amara curled beside him, her head on his shoulder. He didn't speak. Neither did she. They just waited. When the judge returned to deliver her ruling, the room fell silent once more. She declared the marriage legally binding. There was no evidence of coercion beyond circumstantial speculation. The inheritance structure, while unconventional, was permissible. Elizabeth's guardianship of Amara would remain in place, though the court ordered regular oversight. The challenge was denied. Elizabeth's nephew stormed out before the gavel hit the block. Later, as they exited the building, Jaden turned to Elizabeth. "I'm not your pawn anymore," he said. She gave him a small nod. "You never were. I just didn't see it." They returned to the estate in silence. Amara went to her room, exhausted from the day, while Jaden stood at the entrance to the west wing once more. He didn't enter. He didn't need to. The truth was no longer hidden. That night, Elizabeth fell ill. She collapsed in her study, a glass of wine slipping from her hand, shattering on the floor. Jaden was the one who found her. He called for help, sat with her until the ambulance came, and rode with her to the hospital. She didn't speak much. Only once, in the ER, she reached for his hand. "You were supposed to save me from my past," she whispered, "but I think you saved me from myself." Jaden said nothing, but he held her hand until she slipped into unconsciousness. By morning, the doctors confirmed what she already knew. The cancer had advanced. There was little time left. Elizabeth returned home under hospice care. In her final days, she asked to see Jaden each morning. She gave him documents, passwords, letters. One was a revised will. Another was a handwritten note addressed to him. "I used you," it said, "but you turned the tables. You made me human again. Use what I've built not as a weapon, but as a tool. Make it better than I ever did." When she passed, Jaden stood over her body, Amara's hand in his. There were no tears, only a heavy silence. He buried her in a small, private ceremony. No press, no spectacle. Just a boy, his sister, and the woman who had turned their lives inside out. The estate now belonged to him, but he had no intention of staying. Not like this. Not surrounded by echoes. He had one more chapter to write, and it would not be written in silence. The air smelled different after Elizabeth's death. The estate remained still and immaculate, but the silence that followed her absence had a different shape now, less orchestrated, less rigid, more vacant. There were no more late-night summons to her study, no deliberate footsteps echoing down the hallways, no steady voice charting out plans for the future. The Queen had left her court. The castle, though intact, felt hollow. Jaden wandered the rooms in the days following the funeral, not because he needed anything, but because he didn't yet know what came next. Grief was a strange emotion when it followed betrayal. He didn't love Elizabeth, not the way one loved family, but her absence was still heavy. It lingered in the folds of the drapes, in the pages of the books she used to touch, in the ticking clocks that marked time she no longer inhabited. She had been so many things: manipulator, benefactor, teacher, adversary. In the end, she had been something more elusive, human. And that humanity, buried as it had been beneath decades of control and vengeance, was what haunted him most. In her final days, she had given him everything: legal control of the Harding estate, full guardianship of Amara, a letter that he had read 3 times and kept folded in his back pocket. "It was never about the money, Jaden," it read in her careful cursive. "It was about closure. I thought I could find it in power. You showed me it only comes through surrender. Build something better. Let my name mean more through you than it ever did through me." Jaden could have stayed. He could have taken her place at the head of the company. The board would have accepted it. He had been groomed for it, after all. Her last act as CEO had been to solidify his status as sole heir and successor. Contracts had been drawn, votes secured, media narratives managed. The public loved him. He had the education, the story, the face of the next generation, but he didn't want it. The house was a museum of mistakes. The company a monument to control. Staying would have meant becoming her, and he didn't want to become anyone else's version of power. He wanted to be whole, free, true, so he sold it. Not the company, not immediately, but the estate. The Hardin mansion, with all its history and shadow, went quietly to a private buyer. No public auction, no spectacle. Just a transfer of deed and a final walk through the garden with Amara, whose small hand clutched his tightly. "Where will we go now?" she asked. "Somewhere new," Jaden said. He used part of the money to pay off every remaining debt tied to his mother's name. Hospital bills, legal fees, lingering fines. He wanted to burn the weight of the past, not carry it. The rest he funneled into something else, something that had begun forming in his mind on the night he first read Elizabeth's journal and realized the scope of the damage revenge could cause. He bought a building on the east side of the city, in a neighborhood not far from where he and Amara used to sleep under bridges and in freight yards. The building had once been a textile warehouse, long abandoned and graffitied, its windows shattered and walls peeling. Most people wouldn't have seen potential. Jaden saw purpose. He hired a team, not the contractors Elizabeth would have used, but local laborers, many of them recently released from prison or recovering from homelessness. He paid fair wages, asked for their ideas, listened more than he spoke. The renovation took 6 months. During that time, he enrolled Amara in a public charter school and rented a small apartment nearby. Their life was simple, and for the first time it was theirs. When the building was complete, he stood at the entrance beneath the new sign, the Elizabeth Harding Foundation for Youth Empowerment. Underneath, in smaller letters, "A second chance begins with one." Inside were classrooms, counseling offices, job training centers, and a long, sunlit library filled with books donated by people who believed in the mission. There were no portraits of Elizabeth, only a brass plaque near the lobby that read, "In honor of a woman who gave a boy a choice and a world he chose to change." The grand opening was quiet. No press, no television cameras, just community members, volunteers, and a few of Elizabeth's former employees who had chosen to join the effort. Jaden stood at the front of the main hall, dressed in simple slacks and a button-down shirt with Amara seated proudly in the front row. He spoke without notes. "This building is more than a shelter," he said. "It's more than a school or a training center. It's a place where your past doesn't decide your future, where names don't trap you, where power means service, not control." The audience listened in silence, some with tears, some with awe. "I was given a future I didn't expect," he continued. "Now I want to offer that to others, not with conditions, not with chains, but with open doors." When he stepped down from the podium, Amara ran up to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. He rested a hand on her head and smiled. Not for the cameras, not for appearances, for real. Over the following year, the center flourished. Dozens of youth passed through its programs, teens who had been abandoned, criminalized, underestimated. Some earned GEDs, some found housing. Others discovered talents they never knew they had, in painting, in coding, in mechanics. Jaden met each of them personally, remembered their names, listened to their stories. He worked harder than he ever had in the mansion. The hours were long, the funding always just enough but never overflowing. There were setbacks, plumbing failures, bureaucratic delays, critics who accused him of inexperience, but he never stopped. Elizabeth had taught him the value of preparation, of foresight, of endurance. He honored those lessons even as he rejected the frame in which she had wrapped them. One afternoon, about a year after the center opened, Jaden received a letter. It was handwritten in the same neat cursive he had seen in her journals. Dated before her death, it had been entrusted to her lawyer with instructions to deliver it 1 year after her funeral. He read it sitting alone on a bench outside the center, under the shade of a tree that had just begun to bloom. Jaden, by now you've chosen your path. I have no right to hope it was the one I envisioned, but I suspect you've made one far better. I wanted to control everything. That was my flaw. I couldn't accept the chaos of grief, so I tried to mold it into a legacy, but control is not strength. It's fear with a mask. You were never the boy I imagined using. You were always the boy who reminded me of everything I had forgotten. Kindness, courage, choice. I hope you find happiness. I hope you remember that forgiveness is not about forgetting what was done. It's about choosing what comes next. You chose to build. That matters more than you know. Yours, in memory and in hope, Elizabeth. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He didn't cry. He didn't need to. The words weren't an ending. They were a confirmation. A few weeks later, he stood before a new group of young faces at the Foundation's summer orientation. Behind him, the wall bore a new inscription, etched in dark wood. This place was built on broken things. But broken things, when mended with care, can hold even more than before. He looked out at the room, at the boys and girls with tired eyes and hopeful hearts, and smiled. "Let's get to work," he said. As the session began, Amara peeked in from the doorway. She was growing taller, her cheeks rounder, her confidence bolder. She waved at him, then disappeared into the library to read. Jaden watched her go. She had no idea what he had sacrificed for her. Maybe one day she would. Or maybe she never needed to know. What mattered was that she was safe. She was loved, and they were free. Outside, the sky was clear. No clouds, no shadows. A new foundation had been laid, not from stone, but from choice, from resilience, from the quiet strength of a boy who had once been homeless and unwanted and afraid. He was none of those things anymore. He was home. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our other videos for stories that stay with you, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.